Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Today is the fourth talk of our Spring 2024 online lecture series of the Inter-University Research Group on Tibet and the Himalayas, also known in French as Groupe de Recherche Inter-Université sur le Tibet et l'Himalaya, or GRITH, which is led by Isabelle Henrion-Daucy from here, Quebec province. And we are exceptionally honored today to have as our guest speaker, Andrew Fischer from Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And I would like to give the floor to Isabel to introduce him properly.
Okay, well, greetings to everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. So yes, Andrew Fischer is the first Canadian shining abroad of our series, and we're extremely fortunate to have him on board today. He and I have known each other for about over 2 decades, I believe. Yeah, and we share a special temjil, or life connection, because it appears that we have switched our living places. Andrew is from Montreal. Well, it's a little bit more complicated, but let's say Montreal to keep it simple. And he now lives in Brussels. And I am from Brussels, and I now live in Montreal. And we have both spent extensive periods of time on both sides of the Himalayas. And for Andrew, this has meant 7 years among Tibetans in India before his PhD, and 2 years in Amdo and in Western China after his PhD. So Andrew Fischer actually needs no introduction, since his work as a demographer and a development economist of contemporary Tibet. The first one, to my knowledge, but he may correct me, is a reference for anyone who studies current Tibetan issues. His first book, State Growth and Social Exclusion in Tibet, published in 2005, and his second book, The Disempowered Development of Tibet in China, a study in the economics of marginalization, 2014, are crucial analyses of how development in a spectacular state-led economic growth in the PRC is actually tied to social inequality in the Tibetan regions. He has shed light on marginalization, urbanization, rising inter-ethnic tensions, especially between Tibetans and Hui Muslims in Amdo, migration, employment, and education, all central features faced by Tibetans today. It is quite rare, I think, to be able to combine a fluency in both the linguistic and the cultural world of Tibetans, and on the other side, the abstruse, well, at least for me, the abstruse world of statistics and macroeconomics and all the jargon that comes with there. He has since widened the lens of his interests in international development by studying externally financing social policy in developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And his latest book, Poverty as Ideology, published in 2018, was awarded the International Studies in Poverty Prize by the Comparative Research Program on Poverty, CROP. But as we can see today, he has maintained an active research agenda on Tibetan issues, and especially on the changing demographics of Tibet that can be analyzed from the 2020 Chinese population census. So we're all very much looking forward to hear you more about it.
Great. Okay. So yeah, and I should say that I think Jeff Childs is probably the first demographer, not me. So, and but in terms of development economics, yeah, I think I'm probably one of the very few. Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me. It is a pleasure to. Sorry, I can't be there, but it's online anyway. So I guess even if I'd be there, it would be online. But today, what I'll focus on, shall I share my PowerPoint or at this point? Yeah.
Yes, please do.
Here, we will need a PowerPoint. Let me see, how do I share? Share screen. There we go. Great. So.
It's not full screen yet, but We
No,
can see.
no, I know it's taking I ran the danger of not updating my computer. And okay, perfect. You see the full screen now?
Yes, it's
Okay.
fine.
So, yes. So, yeah, basically, I mean, I've been working with the census data since I think 2004 was the first paper I wrote on this. And the issue with understanding population dynamics in any country, China included, is that we can't really say anything at the aggregate without the census, right? We can surveys can measure various aspects of change that are happening in the population, but the only way we can really grasp an overall sense of how the population is changing in the aggregate is through the census. So we wait for the census every 10 years to gain the insights on this incredibly fast pace of change that's been going on in the Tibetan areas, which I think, as all of us researchers of Tibet, insofar as your research touches on some social dimension, it's crucial to understand, well, I mean, as the basic foundation to understand what is happening in Tibet to Tibetans, is to understand how these population changes have been occurring. Because on one hand, it raises a whole host of really fascinating research questions, which the data themselves can't answer per se, but stimulates a whole range of different research ideas that you could research if you have access to the field. And on the other hand, I think it also clarifies a lot of the things that we are researching as well, and often in quite striking ways, or counterintuitive and surprising ways as well, which hopefully will become very evident. And so the last census that was conducted was the 2020 census. Now, of course, part of the problem is that it takes us time to get access to the data. Like in 2010, it took about 2 years for the government to start publicly releasing the more detailed data. So they produced in 2021 some census communiques, which were gave you sort of the some summary data that I used to make some initial analysis in several articles I wrote in 2021. But the problem is that you didn't have access to the census, to the county level data for very detailed analysis. And also you didn't have much breakdown in terms of different minzu. However, I never know how to translate minzu, because nationality, ethnicity, whichever word you prefer. But the 56 minzu groups in China, which is crucial to understand, because if we look at only in the communiques, they only differentiated between the Han and the minorities, but the minorities would include Tibetans, various Muslim groups, Mongolian, Yi, Miao, and other groups. So depending on what region of Tibet you're looking at, these can have a large influence on the minority group in that sense. They started releasing the data in 2022, but I didn't really have access to it until, with the help of some research assistants who prefer to remain anonymous, given current circumstances. It was really only in the maybe last year and even early this year that I started getting, we started getting our hands on most of the county level data. And so, which really allows us to have a very granular analysis of what's happening on the ground. And there's so much information available. I mean, this is the thing, is that I think there's masses of information that most people probably never even look at, that never gets analyzed. And so here, what I'm touching in this presentation is just merely the question of the ethnic or nationality or minzu distribution of populations in the Tibetan areas, because that's such a politicized issue. Other issues that I want to continue exploring, and there's so much information here to dig through that I'm thinking I now need to write a book with all this, is also issues of urbanization, changing employment patterns, education, and so on. And all that you can get a huge amount of detail from the census data. But focusing on the changing minzu, let's just use the word minzu, the minzu demographics of Tibetan areas, both of Tibetans and Tibet. What I already wrote in 2021 was basically that there's, I mean, if just for those of you who, I mean, I imagine this map is probably sort of imprinted on all of your minds from your research of the Tibetan areas in China. These are, obviously, there's a question of whether Xining is a Tibetan area or not, but this is actually Xining and Haidong together. But otherwise, these are, besides Xining and Haidong, these are all the officially recognized by the Chinese government as Tibetan autonomous areas across the Tibetan Autonomous Region, Qinghai, which is, do you see my little cursor?
Yes, no problem.
Yes, the little cursor. And then this is, of course, Gartse and Ngawa, and this is Ganlo or Ganan in Gansu province, and this is the famous Dechin with Shangri-La. I think it's Gyaltong, which is Shangri-La, isn't it? Or is it? Anyways, and essentially what we see, what was emerging initially when we first got access to the data, the census communiques, was basically there's sort of two, I mean, you can divide Tibet in half between the TAR and the rest of Tibet, which is approximately in terms of size, about half and half. So it's the gray areas versus these orange areas here. And also less than half the population lives in the TAR. More than half, about 56-57% of Tibetans live in these other areas. I should say, by the way, that the total number of Tibetans counted in the 2020 census in China was just over 7 million. So no longer 6 million, although, as Jeff has written, that 6 million number is a bit of mythology anyways. But what's interesting too is 98% of them live in the 5 provinces that contain Tibetan autonomous areas. So in Gansu, Qinghai, Sichuan, Yunnan, and Tibetan Autonomous Region. And so only less than 2% live in China outside these areas. So despite speculations that masses of Tibetans were being sent to work in Guangdong by certain people, that doesn't appear to be the case. Probably the population of Tibetans elsewhere in China is roughly, similar to the population of Tibetan exiles living in India, Nepal, and the West. So, which is also about 2% of the total Tibetan population. So, but what we see is that the dynamics in terms of this sort of the ethnic dynamics, in terms of the whole debates about whether there's Chinese migration and so on, is there's a very stark division between the Tibetan Autonomous Region and the other areas in China as well. Whereas what we see in the Tibetan Autonomous Region is, as we would predict, as we have observed in however recently you've been to Lhasa and other places, is a strong in-migration of Han Chinese to the Tibetan Autonomous Region, driven obviously by very high levels of subsidies, which I've also analyzed in other work. But what's surprising, although perhaps not surprising if you understand the demographics and regional development dynamics, is that outside the Tibetan Autonomous Region, what we actually observe is sometime around 2010 to 2020, so in that decade period between the two censuses, is a collapse of the Chinese population in the Tibetan areas outside of the TAR, which is very counterintuitive because we would, especially from 2010 onwards, the Beijing started to actually officially designate all of these Tibetan areas as part of Tibet, not just as the Tibet Autonomous Region. And you saw increasing levels of subsidies going into Qinghai, like what we saw 10 or 20 years previously in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And so, people, the sense was that there was increasing in-migration to these Tibetan areas, all of the gray, and that you see in the map. And yet quite the opposite, what we saw was just actually, in some cases, quite dramatic collapses of the Han Chinese population, which raises a whole bunch of interesting issues of why this happened, which I don't presume to be able to answer, although I've been exploring it with some of my PhD students. But at least in this presentation, I can show you the evidence, right? And now, obviously, a lot of people are suspicious of the numbers. I think a lot of the suspicion of the numbers is partly based on lack of understanding exactly of how the census is collected and its difference with other sources of population data. And also the fact that where we see these very sharp declines in Han populations are in areas that are not politically sensitive. They're not in the parts of Tibet that people think are Tibet. That, for instance, in Wenchuan, where the earthquake was in 2008, in the public imagination, it's not Tibet, even though it's a Tibetan autonomous area with a large Chinese population. And that's where we see the collapses in Chinese population, not in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. So it's not like the census has been trying to cover up an increase of Han in migration to the TAR. I did this figure to just demonstrate these two patterns that are going in opposite directions. And so what you have here on the vertical axis is the percentage change in Han Chinese share from, so the red dot would have been and then on the bottom here, you have the Han Chinese share of the population at the end of the year, 2010 or 2020. So the rate of change would have been between the 2010 to the 2000 and 2010 is the red dot. And then the blue dot is from 2010 to 2020. So what you see in the TAR is that there was both, and this is 0 would indicate in or out migration, right? So if you're above 0, it's net in migration, below 0, net out migration. So what it's showing in the TAR is that there was an increasing number of Han Chinese people in the TAR in the 2000s, and this accelerated. So the arrow going up shows an acceleration of the increase between the 2000s and the 2010s, right? And roughly similar to what we see happening in Xinjiang. So in that sense, Xinjiang and the TAR are similar. You have an accelerating increase of the Han population share over the 2 decades. Whereas in Qinghai, you see the opposite thing happening. You see net out migration of the Han population share, and that's accelerating like downwards, right? So it's the decrease is accelerating over time. And we also see that to a limited extent, smaller extent in Gansu. Sichuan's a bit ambiguous, but the problem with Sichuan is if you look at it as a province, it's most of the population is Han, right? So the Tibetan population in the Tibetan areas is very tiny relative to the province. But which is why we need to look at the prefecture and county level data, especially for the Tibetan areas outside of the TAR. But Qinghai, on the other hand, is 97.2% Tibetan areas, currently around just over 30% Tibetans and Mongol and Mongolian, which are sort of the 3 Tibeto-Buddhist groups in Qinghai, the 3 big ones. And it's to the point where, as you can see, this blue dot for Qinghai is approaching 50%, which means it's almost minorities in Qinghai. This includes, it isn't just Tibetans here, it includes Muslims. But they're probably already over 50% of the population in Qinghai. So Qinghai is essentially becoming a minority province, a majority. Minorities are the majority in Qinghai, if not now, very soon, definitely by the 2030 census. Yeah, just to highlight these cases, right? And don't forget the Tibetan populations of Sichuan and Qinghai and Gansu together exceed the Tibetan population of the TAR. So, and they're indigenous Tibetan areas. It's not. I remember one journalist, when the 2008 protests broke out, a journalist asked me, "How did the Tibetans get to Qinghai and Sichuan?" Yeah, let me take you through the story. But anyways, so yeah, I'll show you the map several times. So in Qinghai, again, what we're talking about is this province right here, like that. So this one. And so this is where we see the pattern diverges from the TAR. And I mean, just to give you, these are the aggregate numbers to show you at the provincial level. What we see in the TAR is the Han population increased very quickly from a small base, from a small number, but still increased quickly, and so rose to just over 12% of the population by 2020. Don't forget, the census was conducted in November, which means what you're capturing here are probably the year-round resident Han Chinese population. So you're not capturing the huge influxes of tourists and people catering to tourists in the summer months. So obviously, when most of us go to Lhasa in the summer months, it appears much more than this if we could evaluate that. But a lot of that is like it's like the problem with tourist areas. They explode during the tourist months and then they collapse in the winter months. And hence you have this shift in the share, so a 4% shift, whereas in the 2000s, it would have been a 2% shift of share, right? And then you also have the increase of other minorities, which would mean largely Hui Muslims and a few other groups. And then whereas in Qinghai, what we see is the opposite pattern. We see this very, very almost no growth in the Han Chinese population versus quite a strong growth in the Tibetan population that is most likely this is probably roughly at the same level of the what we call the natural population increase rate of Tibetans in the province. So basically, the natural population increase rate is populations either change through births and deaths, or they change through in and out migration. So if you exclude in and out migration, you get just what the population growth that it can be explained by births minus deaths. And so if we assume that, for instance, Tibetans, I mean, based on the data that we've seen, I've seen their natural rate of population increase currently is probably around 9% or so. So it's probably basically showing that the increase in the Tibetan population in Qinghai is largely staying in the province. It's in a net sense. It's most of the increase is explained by natural increase, not by migration. Whereas the very, very low levels of Han, for instance, at 0.3% over a decade, is probably much less than the natural population increase rate, and hence is explained by net outmigration, right? So this is just how we evaluate these things. And interestingly, of course, the Mongol and the Mongolians have been shrinking actually population, and which is again raises a bunch of interesting research questions for any of you who work on Mongolians or Mongol in Qinghai. Demographically, they're actually more similar, if not more extreme, than the Han population in that sense. They have a similar demographic profile as the Han population, and they're actually shrinking. And then you see the strong growth as well among the Muslim population, which could include some in migration because from Gansu, for instance. And then in Gansu, we see the same thing, even more extreme, where the population of Gansu actually shrunk. And that's entirely explained, more than entirely explained, by the shrinking of the Han population. Whereas Tibetans, in this case, Tibetans plus Mongol and Muslim minorities are all increasing. In Sichuan, again, Sichuan's problematic because, as I show you here, the population currently, well, at the 2020 census was over 83 million, of which 77% or 93% were Han. So whatever we're seeing here in the numbers in Sichuan is in terms of proportions, we can't take too seriously. But again, you see the Tibetans growing roughly at what would probably be their natural population increase rate in Sichuan. And the Qiang actually, like the Mongol, have a similar demographic profile to the Han. Some of you could probably explain to me the Qiang. I'm not sure well, I'll explain that a bit later when we get into the results on Ngawa. And the strong growth in the other minorities is partly driven by the Yi, but in any case. And we see a similar, Yunnan is actually the only one of the minorities at provincial level were growing less than the Han, interestingly enough. But we don't see that actually at the level of Dachin necessarily. And then I was just comparing this here. This is from the article I wrote, although it has a bit more detail, comparing it to Xinjiang, where we see the TAR looking very much like Xinjiang, but not like any of the other provinces containing Tibetan areas. But here, what the thing is that you could have a situation, for instance, in Qinghai, where the Tibetan population is growing, but because it's migrating out of Tibetan areas to, say, Xining, city, the capital city, the Tibetan population is actually falling in the Tibetan areas, and vice versa. Even if the Han population overall is stagnant in Qinghai, there could be in-migration in Tibetan areas of Han, right? So this is why you need to go down to the prefecture and county level to really understand what's going on. And so this is what I've done. I haven't fully explored the data yet on TAR. I've been focusing on an article that, finishing an article that looks specifically at Amdo, the Amdo regions. But this is from the article I wrote in 2021. And essentially what you see here, interestingly, in the TAR is you do, where the growth of population, of Han population is concentrated, is specifically in, I think I've highlighted it, Lhasa, of course, you know, where you see the close to the lowest proportion of minorities in the population. And if you can break this down by the districts of Lhasa and look at the inner urban core of Lhasa, then you would probably see this even falling much lower, to a much lower proportion of minorities, which we can do. I have the yearbook. I just haven't had time to unpack it yet. But also we see, so this is where the Han population had a very strong increase in share. And this is the year-round resident Han population, right? So, you know, for those of us going to Lhasa and seeing this strong increase in the Han population, it's confirmed by this data in that sense. But where the other two areas where you see it concentrated are basically in Ningchi and in Ngari, which are, of course, are the two areas that are having border conflicts with India, right? And Ningchi in particular, sorry, I'm using the Chinese spelling here. I correct that later, but not to be. But in Ningchi, of course, that's also a lower altitude part of TAR where a lot of Chinese like to go because the climate and altitude is easier to deal with and so on. But if we look at the more remote areas, like in Nagchu, Shannan is Loka, and Chamdo, we see an increasing share of Han population, but much less so. It's more similar to what we see, say, in parts of Amdo, for instance, than in the TAR. But the bulk of the population, Han population increase in the TAR is happening in, as I said, Lhasa and the border areas that are having conflicts, right? I could break this down into more detail at another point, and I will in a book I'll eventually write. But so just to remind you here, Lhasa is this, so that's the area we're looking at here. So it includes the rural and urban areas of Lhasa. So these would be a city jurisdiction now. And then Ningchi is this area here, right along Arunachal Pradesh, where they're having the border conflict with India. And then Ngari is this area here. So again, with the border conflict with India and bordering Khotan in Xinjiang. Just to give you a sense, so in these, and then I suspect we could also break it down once I look into the county level data of, we could probably suspect that the Han Chinese are heavily concentrated in probably a few of the borderline counties of this prefecture, not over the whole prefecture, which is typically what we see. If anyone has any questions, by the way, you can just interrupt me because I don't see any of you now. This is the problem with online presentations. But anyways, feel free to, I like being interrupted or cuts the monologue. But anyways, so
far it's all very clear.
Okay, that's good. I'm just wondering if okay, so basically, actually forget this slide because I realized I should have cut this slide. I have a more detailed slide, having more information. But because the TAR is entirely Tibetan areas, you know, looking at the provincial aggregate, we can get a sense of the only Han Chinese who are in the TAR are people who have migrated there. So they're not indigenous to the province, unlike other provinces where half of Sichuan is where the vast majority of Han Chinese live, and they're indigenous to that, to eastern Sichuan. We can't look at the provincial aggregates to assess what exactly is happening. And so these are basically the sort of the prefecture level jurisdictions outside of the, well, I don't even have Dachin here in the Yunnan, so this is an old slide, forget that. But basically, but in analyzing this is where you see the patterns starting to emerge that are very, very, very different from the TAR, right? I'll explain a bit further here. And as I've been working on this more and preparing this article that should be published very soon with MSCAT, MSCAT, I suppose, Isabelle.
Yeah, études mongoles, tibétaines et centra-asiatiques.
Oui, c'est ça, c'est ça. And anyways, and so because there I'm only analyzing Amdo, and I think the patterns are quite similar in the regions of Kham outside of TAR as well. And what we see is three dominant patterns and one qualification. What I'd say is one qualification. The first pattern, which I think is really actually important to emphasize, is that what we are seeing up until quite recently is rapid Tibetan population growth in remote counties of, say, like Golok, Yushu, and Western Ngawa and Gartse. And these are also areas where Tibetans constitute most of the population, like over 90%. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And I think it's safe to qualify it as rapid population growth. I think when I show you the numbers, I think Jeff will agree with me that it will qualify as rapid population growth from an international comparison, right? And also what's very interesting is that in something I only discovered recently, because there's so much data to be look at, is like you keep learning things, is that Qinghai is very generous with their data, unlike Sichuan, which isn't very generous with their data. And in Qinghai, actually, you can get the population pyramids for each of the ethnic groups in the province. And there was actually apparently a baby boom in Qinghai from roughly 2005 to 2015, right? The largest cohort, 5-year cohort in the population in Qinghai in 2020 was actually aged 5 to 9 years old. It wasn't actually like later in the 20s or 30s that what you'd see elsewhere in China, which is really interesting because, again, I go back to, some of my Tibetan PhD students say, were you aware there was a baby boom in Qinghai? And they're like, oh, no. And, it's these types of things that you see through the data that you're not necessarily aware of in the field. And yet they actually could be quite interesting. I mean, there's arguably more Tibetans under the age of 10 currently in Qinghai than there are in the entire exile population, for instance. Very interesting. And the data also that was used for the infamous or famous, whichever view you have, the Colonial Boarding Schools report by Tibetan Action Network Institute, I think it was called. The population data they're using was completely out of date as well. So, but anyways, so rapid population growth, a real thing. And in Qinghai specifically, this was complemented by slight increases in Han numbers and shares in these remote counties, but from very small numbers. So basically, Golok and Yushu and also Malo, which is where Reb Colony is located, had slight increases in Han shares, similar to what we would see in Nakchu, for instance, or in these remote counties in the TAR. But in a context where Tibetans are growing quite rapidly. I mean, if you have an increase of the population from 1 to 2, that's 100% increase, right? So that will increase the share of that group of 2 people. So it's, this is the way, the rising share has to be taken with a grain of salt in that sense. Elsewhere, outside of these remote counties, in the Tibetan areas outside of TAR, what we see is a collapse, sometimes very dramatic, in the numbers and shares in many of the more central prefectures and counties that border Han areas or that already had higher Han shares. And it's to emphasize here, it's not just a collapse in the share, but it's a collapse in the actual numbers. It's depopulation of Han. It's like the Han leaving in droves, basically. Just basically looks like in the census of people just closing up shop and leaving. And the third pattern is a remarkable increase, which we know, of the inner city Tibetan populations in the provincial capitals of specifically Xining, Lanzhou, and Chengdu. which I'll talk about more. How am I doing for time, by the way? Have I already used up a lot of time? Oh, okay.
That half an hour.
Okay,
So
okay. So let me, and the qualification is that at least in Qinghai only, we see a marginal increase in the Muslim population shares in the Tibetan areas of Qinghai. So the Muslim populations are growing at a slightly faster pace in the Tibetan areas of Qinghai than the Tibetan population is. Which is interesting, especially from the perspective of my work on Tibetan-Muslim conflict 20 years ago. But interestingly, we don't observe this in Gansu or Ngawa, where Muslims also had a historical presence. So if I can just show you some figures now. This is the first point. So the first point is the rapid Tibetan population growth in remote counties. Here I'm showing the three counties that fall into that, well, especially Golok and Yushu in Qinghai province, where we see, if I can especially draw your attention to the decadal, how do you pronounce that? Decadal change of the, and this is breaking down into Han Tibetans and Muslims. The Muslims are mostly Hui, but also Dongxiang, Salo and Dongxiang, right? What we see here is, so this is my qualification, you see a very rapid growth in the Muslim population, but from a very, very small base. And you see a more rapid growth in the Han Chinese population from a very small base in these provinces, well, for a relatively small base in these provinces. But you see this large growth in the Tibetan population, Golok, growing, in the case of Golok, almost 18%, which is 1.6%. I wouldn't qualify that as rapid yet. I mean, it's slowing down. But the thing is that there's counties within Golok that are growing at 2.5% a year. And that's, I think, it can only be explained by natural increase. It's not the Tibetans themselves that are migrating into these counties. So the Muslims in the Han, these rates of growth among the Muslims in Han and Golok are entirely probably from in-migration, right? Very little from natural increase of Han and Muslims having babies in Golok, right? Whereas the Tibetan growth of 17.5% is probably entirely explained by Tibetans having babies, right? It would probably even be more than this because there's out-migration from Golok. Right? So because there's out-migration in Golok, if there wouldn't be out-migration from Golok, the growth would even be faster. So we have a county, I have it in a slide later, like in Darlak, that's, I'll show it to you when the slide comes up. But in Yushu, we see a similar thing where the, Han from a small base growing slightly faster than Tibetans, the Muslims from a tiny base, there's an increase in 3,000. So it means they've increased almost, 4 times, but it's from only 1,000 or so in Yushu, right? And so, but leaving the shares of the population, even at the end of this period, are still almost 96% in Yushu and 91% in Golok, right? So you see a slight decrease in the Tibetan share, like you see in places like Nakshu in the TAR. And in Malo, which is Huangnan in Chinese, where Rebkong is located, the growth of the population, of the Tibetan population, is slower than you see in these other twos. These are more demographically similar to the central areas. But I put this example in here just because you see a similar pattern where these are the only real prefecture level locations where you see the Tibetans losing share slightly, but from a high percentage. So the Tibetan plus Mongolian and Mongol population, because there's a lot of Mongol in Malo, and there's also one county in Malo that is a Mongolian county, right? So 68 plus 16, 78, yeah, slightly less than, I think it's rough, almost 90% basically in that case. So again, that is Yushu being here, Golok being here, and Malo being this one right here, right? But then the other ones are Tsojang, Tsonup, and Tsohlo, which is Chabcha, right? And of course, Tsonup in particular is quite interesting because, well, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I should not do that. let me continue. Some county examples of these rapidly growing ones. As I said, Darla County, the population grew by 28.4%, which is an annual rate of about 2.5%, which you have to count for compounding. To put that in other terms, it means the population at that rate will double in 28 years. And I think that qualifies. I think Jeff would agree with me that a 2.5% population growth rate qualifies as rapid population growth. I think there's not many countries left in the world where they're growing 3% a year, but the ones that are growing at, say, 2.5% a year would be like Nigeria or countries like that. And also here, the interesting thing is that the youth ratio is, we don't have the data of the natural population increase rates at the county level, certainly not broken down by minzu. But by looking at the youth ratio, we can sort of see that it's a very high youth ratio. This would again be similar to quite a few African countries. I think maybe Pakistan, or I think Pakistan might even be lower than that. So what we're looking at is a recent history in Darlak of quite high fertility, right? To have produced this type of youth ratio, which only recently, say in the last 5 years, do we see the cohorts starting to shrink in the population structure. And the combination of the high population growth rate plus the youth structure, the population growth rate among Tibetans plus the very high youth ratio suggests that this was the population growth was largely driven by births and not by migration among the Tibetan population. And then the Tibetan population share is still at 94%. So that's just a good example. In Matu County, also in Golok, it grew by also 28%, right? And we see similar patterns in Zatu County and Yushu, which had a larger population, because the only thing with Matu and Darlak is they're quite small. But in Zatu, which is a larger population, Tibetans also grew 18%, a very high youth ratio of 39%. Now, obviously, if there's a lot of out-migration from the county, and the out-migration is mostly adults, then that would boost, it would sort of blow up the youth share due to out-migration and not because of high fertility, right? So in this case of Zatu County, because the growth rate is lower than in these ones, and yet still a very, very high youth ratio, this might be explained more by strong out-migration from the county. But that being said, strong out-migration from the county also means that the actual growth, once you account for that out-migration, was even stronger than this, right? So perhaps similar to Darlak and Matu in that sense. Yeah, which is the point I make there. But we also see in, say, Western Ngawa Prefecture, for instance, or examples like Zamtang County, which the minority population grew 15%, 95% minority share, or Kakok, Hongyuan in Chinese in Ngawa, where it grew 16%. And or interesting one, Sershu, which I find interesting. It's like a little population engine. The Sershu is tucked right in between Golok and Yushu at the very, very northern tip of Gartse. And yeah, you see a population growth of 26%, and that's quite of a large population for Tibetan standards. The Tibetan county population was almost 100%, 100,000 Tibetans in 2020. So this growth rate meant there was an addition of 20,000 people to the population net over the decade, right? Which is the point I make here. So then we go to I think I forgot a figure here, which is showing you. Oh no, I didn't. Yeah. So then we go to the second case, if I have time, which is the counties and prefectures other than these more remote ones, where basically you see the collapse in the Han population. And here, this is very recent because I've been able to just get the data at the county level. I've included Haidong City, which is not a Tibetan autonomous area, because it includes a substantial population of Tibetans. Ping'an, the birthplace of the current Dalai Lama, was in Haidong City, and in various counties, Muslim counties, there's significant Tibetan minorities. Like the previous Panchen Lama was born in Shunhua. And there's like a sort of 25% of Shunhua is traditionally Tibetan, and there's a monastery there, and that's so it's and similarly in Malo, there's in Chensa County, there's a significant minority of Muslims in Chensa County that have been there for ages, about 30% of the population. So there's this intermixing that happens in these areas. So what we see throughout all these cases, Haidong City is, so the red means the population fall, right? And in this case, this is falling shares. So the Han, so overall in Haidong City, the population fell by 2.7%, which is dominated by the Han, but also by the Mongor, interestingly enough, because there is actually a Mongor county, a minority county, Hui Mongor County in Haidong. But even the Tibetans fell in Haidong City, but by less than the Han and Mongor and Muslims. And so what we see is but then the Muslims increased quite rapidly in Haidong, right? So what we actually see is Tibetans leaving the Tibetan areas in Muslim counties, although the opposite is not happening in Qinghai, at least. For the Muslims are increasing in Tibetan counties. So there's this interesting dynamic happening between Tibetans and Muslims. So the Tibetan share fell slightly, but not by that as much as the Han or the Mongolians, because it was falling less fast than the Han and the Mongor, right? And don't forget, Mongor, if you go to Rebkong and eat Mongor, you'll probably have a hard time differentiating them from Tibetans, right? So it's just to say they're a locally indigenous Tibeto-Buddhist group in that sense. Zhejiang is the prefecture to the north of Xining, north and east. And there you see this, again, a typical pattern, shrinking population dominated by the Han Chinese. And also, again, by the Mongor. There's a Mongor county in Zhejiang, but not much increase of Muslims, and a slight increase of Tibetans. So this is lower than what their natural rate of population increase would probably be. Hence, it probably reflects a strong degree of net outmigration, but not enough to completely wipe out the additional births to the population, right? That's essentially what we're talking about. In Solo, which is where Chabcha is located, Chabcha is the county seat. Again, we see almost no growth in the population overall, because a shrinking of the Han population by almost 10%, and a slow increase of Tibetans, again, probably because of a lot of outmigration, and this faster increase in Muslims. That was the qualification there, but from a relatively small number, right? Again, the Muslims are largely concentrated in Trika, which is Guide, which is where there's a big, huge hydroelectric power plant, and it's neighboring Chensa, so it's close to Xining as well. It's the closest county to Xining. So the Muslim population there is partly indigenous to that county, right? But it is interesting here that even though you have all these major hydroelectric developments in Solo prefecture, in a place like Mangra in particular, in Trika in particular, you see this collapsing Han numbers, right? And then that's pretty much all across the prefecture. And Sonup is extremely interesting because Sonup is Haishi, which is Golmut, where the railroad leaves to Lhasa. It's also in the late 90s. It became famous for the so-called Qinghai project, where the World Bank was financing the resettlement of a whole bunch of people from Eastern Qinghai to Western Qinghai, which were largely Hui Muslim. And yet, so a lot of people at that point were speculating that, and the Han were the majority of the county, because Golmut is the second largest city in Qinghai, built around the mining industry and so on, very intensive mining. So this could be the classic case that people would say represents sort of population invasion and the future of other Tibetan areas, even though its characteristics were quite exceptional. But even there, over the 2000s, we see this very sharp drop in the Han population of 14% over 10 years, right? So a moderate growth in the Tibetan population, a shrinking of, again, the Mongolian population, because this is the Tibetan Mongolian Autonomous Prefecture. And then a strong growth in the Muslim population. In this particular, it looks here as if like the Muslims are supplanting or replacing, substituting the Han in at least partially in their perhaps role in the regional economy. Hence a sharp increase in share. And the Muslims now currently are larger than the Tibetans and Mongolians combined in this prefecture, which is quite interesting. But the other thing is the Han population is collapsing, right? So in an economy where you would have all the conditions logically based on our previous analysis, where to say this might be an exceptional case of in-migration, it's turned out to be an exceptional case of out-migration. Again, just to show you where this is, we're talking about Haishi is this area here, right? So Golmot being here, and the county seat being I think Terlinka, if that's the Tibetan of Delinka. Yeah, it is. So I'm sure I'm going over time now. I don't want to exhaust you completely, but I presume you're all fascinated by this because you all work on Tibet, and so you're looking at this saying, "Oh my God, this is so fascinating." I find it fascinating, but if I present this to somebody who's not fascinated by Tibet, they're like, they might get a bit bored. But nonetheless, again, some county examples where you see like reductions in the Han population in Hual, Tongde by 36%, and Dakar. This is again in Solo, Hainan Prefecture, in Qinghai or Dakar by 26%, or in Mangra, Guinan, by 40%. I did field work in Guinan. This fascinating. In Mangra, for instance, the Han population was 16% already, so it wasn't insignificant, but it just shrunk, like it collapsed almost by half. Similar in Tsonu, Paishi, the area I was talking about for the mining, you see in some cases counties collapsing by over half, or one county, the Temchen or Tianju County, by 71%. That's over 2/3 of the Han population just basically disappeared. Well, they didn't disappear, but you know what I mean. Just to zoom ahead, so we see similar patterns in Gannan Prefecture and Ngawa Prefecture, Gartse Prefecture, and Dechen Prefecture as well in Yunnan. Any of you who've been doing research in Dechen. Where you see in Gannan, the almost no growth in the population of Gannan is entirely dominated by the Han Chinese. In Ngawa, you see a reduction in all populations, all groups, except the Tibetan reduction is slower than the other ones, like the Chinese dropping by almost 18%. And hence their share rises because they're falling slower than the other groups. And interesting here in Ngawa, where you did have some aspects of Tibetan Muslim tension, the Hui population has been shrinking very rapidly as well. And also, as I was saying earlier, all the Qiang areas, and maybe one of you can explain to me whether the Qiang are the same as Gyarong, but the Qiang, a lot of the reduction in the population in Ngawa is concentrated in eastern Ngawa, and a lot of those counties are Qiang counties, not Tibetan counties. And so in western Ngawa, we see the population growth that I was referring to earlier, like in Zamtang, and in eastern Ngawa, where it's more Qiang and Han dominated, you see collapsing populations at the county level. And in Gartse as well, you see in Gartse, the Yi have been growing very rapidly, the Tibetans quite slowly, probably because of strong out-migration, but the Han following, right? And Dechen as well, interestingly, and even in Dechen prefecture in Yunnan, you see this sharp reduction in the Han population, right? And I don't have the breakdown of the minority groups yet for Dechen. And as I said, Sichuan's not very generous with the data, so I have the breakdown of Tibetan and Qiang and so on at the prefecture level, but not the county level. That's not available. Haven't been able to find it with my help of my PhD students. So, and just to remind you here, so what the areas we're looking at was here. This is Gartse, Ngawa, Ganlo, and Dechen, right? Not to abuse your time, but some county examples. In Ganlo, for instance, Gannan in Chinese, you see shrinking Han population in most counties, whether the Han were in the majority or the minority. Even in remote counties like Xiahe, where Sachu, which is where Labrang is located, we see the Chinese population shrinking by over 6%. Although in Ganlo we see a strong increase in the Han population in the prefecture seat of Tsu or Huzhou, where it grew 35%, but interestingly, the growth of the Han population in Tsu was less than the reduction in Han population in several of the counties. So probably what's happening is that some of the Han might be going to Tsu, or maybe not even, they just leave altogether, but then some other Han come in. There could be churning in that sense. These are all research questions that would be interesting to know, right? So, in Ngoma Prefecture, as I said, the Han reductions are particularly strong in the eastern counties like Juzaigo. Many of you probably have been to Juzaigo. It's a famous tourist spot with a park where the Han population fell by 22%, right? So these were supposed to be the counties where, through tourism, we attract all these Chinese, like Lhasa or something, right? You know, as I said, more examples here. I've already made some of these points. I know Tseringso, who's in the audience, is from Daewoo, which is an exception in Ganlo because the Tibetan population, it was the only case in Ganlo where the Tibetan population actually fell and the Han population increased. But oh no, sorry, yeah. And also you have strong, as I said, by comparing the growth rates with the likely natural population increase rates and population structure and other types of data points that you can corroborate with and triangulate, strong suggestions that there's strong outmigration of Tibetans as well as Han from many of these counties, but especially from the Muslim counties in Haidong, in Qinghai. And then the last point on the urbanization, I won't go into the Muslim growth much, but just to make the point here that where a lot of this outmigration of Tibetans is going seems to be in net terms bypassing the prefecture seats and going straight to the capital cities, in the sense that if we look at the counties that are the prefecture seats, like Rebgong, like Chabcha, like Tsu, or like other places, Markham and so on. The growth, we see a growth in the Tibetan population, but not by much more than you would expect from natural population increase rates. So the population is not shrinking because of outmigration, but it's not growing either because of in-migration, right? Which suggests that in net terms, the Tibetans who are out-migrating from all these areas are just bypassing the prefectures, or else they're locating themselves in the prefectures and people in the prefecture seats are then migrating out. That's another thing that could be happening. And then they're all going to the capital cities. And so what we're seeing is the emergence of inner city Tibetan, or downtown Tibetans, right? I don't know what to call it, right? But basically what we see here is that, for instance, in Xining, the Tibetan population grew by 31%. But what's important here, in the next slide, I detail it. So Xining is right here, as we saw. Chengdu is right there. And we don't see, Lanzhou's there. Basically, they're concentrated in particular in Chengdong district and Chengbei districts. So Chengdong district is the traditional, if any of you have been to Xining, it's the predominantly Muslim area, but where a lot of the Tibetan market was based, a lot of the transport hubs are based and so on. Whereas Chengbei district is the district where all the universities are now being centered in. So Qinghai Normal University and a bunch of other universities. And what's interesting there is that the Tibetan population more than doubled in Chengdong and more than about tripled in Chengbei district. Whereas in the outlying districts of Xining, it's like what we see in Haidong, the Tibetan population is falling in like Huangzhong district. And it's concentrating in the urban cores, right? Which is really interesting. We see the same thing in Lanzhou city. The Tibetan Mongol combined population doubled, but also especially in Chengdu city. It's fascinating because in Chengdu, the Tibetan population tripled. Now, I have to say that the Yi population increased by over six times, right? And is catching up on the Tibetans. And also, I've been told as well that what's interesting too in Chengdu is that you have the Tibetans who are actually very much occupying the downtown areas, and a lot of, sort of, you have a process of suburbanization where a lot of Chinese people are then moving out to the peripheries. So this is why I said, well, maybe we could start talking about inner city Tibetans in that sense. But it's not inner city Tibet because these cities are outside Tibet, but it's where a lot of the Tibetans are moving, right? So if we look at these numbers of increase of the Tibetans, like 38,000 in Xining, 14,000 in Lanzhou, and 67,000 in Chengdu, mostly because of in-migration, because the rates of growth are too fast to be because of increased rates, especially that the city fertility is quite low. The shares are still tiny, but it helps to explain what's driving the migration dynamics, especially say in Ngawa, for instance, where the Tibetan population has been shrinking along with the Qiang, and the Qiang have also had this very strong growth in Chengdu. If you hear a bark, it's my dog who hears me and wants to come and play, but let me open the door. Okay, come here. Okay, so this is, she doesn't understand that I'm talking. So we know this is happening, but it's just fascinating to see it happening and the speed by which it's happening as well. I mean, I'll just quickly conclude now because I mostly want to share all those insights with you because I find them so fascinating. And hold on, I guess the whole dog and wife are trying to get my attention now. But oops, sorry. Here, just a second. There we go. Basically, as I said in the beginning, it raises a whole host of fascinating research questions, which can only be answered through further fieldwork and a related investigation into the local circumstances of each case, right? Because it shows these general trends, and yet at the same time, each county, in its exceptions, it makes you ask, well, what's happening in this county? Like, why did this county experience such a collapse in the Han population, like in Haishi, for instance, or in Sonu, in Qinghai? What's driving the outmigration of Chinese? Is it government policy or is it despite government policy, right? It's quite possible that the government didn't intend for that to happen, and yet people, due to various circumstances or economic cyclical things, or the increasing capital intensity of mining and so on, just leave, right? Also, what's been driving the Muslim in-migration to Tibetan counties in Qinghai is a lingering question that is interesting. And what's been driving this, various Tibetan patterns of migration, especially this extremely rapid growth of Tibetan communities in Xining, Lanzhou, and Chengdu, how's that being experienced? How are they experiencing the cities? How are they appropriating the city for themselves, which I know Andrew Grant has written about, but it definitely deserves more research, given the pace of this change that we're looking at. And also, given that especially in Qinghai, you have this rising population density of both Tibetans and Muslims, despite outmigration, how has this affected their coexistence or tensions in the context of these changes, right? And I mean, just as a last point, I would say, I mean, generally speaking, all these insights confirm my earlier analyses and arguments. If any of you have read any of that, which as I was arguing 20 years ago, that if we understand development studies, development economics, or demography, sociology, and so on, the dominant structural trend facing relatively poor peripheral areas is for net outmigration, not net in-migration, right? So short of massive levels of subsidies like we see in the TR, we wouldn't logically tend to predict, as we go forward in the future, 20 years ago, a big influx of Han Chinese to Tibetan areas, right? Particularly given that a lot of the Tibetan areas outside of TR are quite, fiscally austere, right? They don't have a lot of money, despite subsidies and so on. It's essentially what we've been observing. But I think, despite the fact that I predicted that, I was actually quite surprised by the pace and the extent of the Han outmigration from many of the areas outside the TAR. And of course, in this presentation, I've only just covered this issue of the changing minzu sort of demography in the Tibetan areas. All of this is happening in context of rapid urbanization and depopulation as well of the Tibetan rural areas, which would require another presentation to talk about. But it's also emphasizing the point that even if the Han are migrating out of Tibetan areas, it's also the pace of change. It's the speed of urbanization that Amdo Tibetans, or Tibetans in general. Sorry, this is drawing from the paper I'm writing, so I was focused on Amdo. As they move into the urban areas, the demand that puts on urban employment opportunities, even in the context of slight reductions of Han population, it still might create a lot of competitive tensions in that sense over scarce urban employment opportunities and so on, or not, right? I mean, that's a big question, is the hopeful thing coming out of this is that actually in a lot of Tibetan areas, they are actually becoming more Tibetan. And so that opens up possibilities in the future of them appropriating these new urban spaces as sort of, as political conditions change potentially or not, I'm not sure. But these are all kind of the interesting questions that a lot of this raises, right? Of course, you can see my bias towards the Eastern Tibetan areas versus the TAR, in the sense that in the TAR, it's a very different story. But even there, because the Han and other migrant populations are so much concentrated on, say, Lhasa and a few other urban areas, basically they're almost entirely urban, these populations. It also opens up the space for similar types of dynamics that we're observing in Eastern Tibet in the more remote parts of TAR, for instance, right? I'll leave it there because it would be great to have a discussion and questions. You've been all very quiet and I can't see any of you. So I'll stop sharing so I can see you. Okay. So.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this super inspiring, energetic, and full of enthusiasm presentation. It was hard to imagine how one can talk about numbers in such a dynamic way. I'm very inspired. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. But maybe somebody wants to initiate with the live question, and then I go to the question asked by Dawa. I don't know if anyone wants to, or we can just start with a question from Dawa Lokitsang. And her first question is, how much of this out-migration driven by urbanization development policies and massive infrastructure developments like hydropower dams?
Are you referring to Han or Tibetan out-migration? But the Tibetan, okay, yeah. So in certain counties, definitely, yes. Like for instance, in Haishi, we see from certain counties to shrinking Tibetan populations, and then they're being resettled to, say, a lot of the resettlements of Tibetan pastoralists in Haishi, and I think even Yushu have been resettled in the Delinka county near the prefecture seat, for instance. And so in that case, that would be those population dynamics would be explained partly by things like resettlements. Although in that case, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting how these numbers are quite small, right, in terms of the population changes in that sense, right? We're talking about a few thousand. We're not talking about tens or thousands or more, right? Which I suspect would be the case in the infrastructure developments like with the hydropower dams and so on that we're hearing about right now. I mean, they're in terms of cultural, the cultural importance of the sites that are being destroyed by the flooding is obviously massive. But in population terms, I'm not sure. You'd probably see it at county level, the impact of this, but it's not hugely significant at the aggregate level, right? There's the other question, that's it's what degree is the urbanization itself object of government policy? So is the government driving this urbanization. I mean, I know that's definitely Gerald Roche and James Leibold and Ben Hillman made this point in an article they wrote for China File 2017, I think, and they made the claims that this is all part of a grand strategy of Beijing to assimilate Tibetans and so on. I mean, or is it the case actually the whole construction of the boarding schools, the intention of that is actually to keep Tibetans in the prefecture seats, not necessarily for them to migrate out to Xining, right? So I'm not sure in that sense how it really requires more research because and I know I talked to Tibetan researchers, like a PhD I just examined for a researcher from Yushu, who was actually saying, we have boarding schools in Jaikundo, but the problem is that they're not even fully utilized, and people would rather send their kids to Xining, put them in Chinese schools rather than put them in the boarding school. And you see this in Yushu, for instance, this quite what we could interpret or infer as quite strong outmigration. To what degree is that driven by government policy, or to what degree is it despite government policy of trying to keep them like in more in Yushu itself, right? Because I know the government always has these concerns about the pace of population growth and so on. Like a lot of the Tibetan migration to Chengdu is, as we know, driven by Tibetans themselves. I mean, Tibetans in Tewo, in Ganlo or in Lhasa, all across the Tibetan plateau are buying up condos and property in Chengdu, right? And a lot of people like to move to Chengdu, and that's not necessarily government policy to encourage them to do so, but it's a lot of Tibetans choosing to do so, like people with money and so on, right? They might make a whole bunch of money off Yartsagumbu and then invest it in a property in Chengdu as much as they might invest it in the prefecture town, right? So there's all these types of questions that I think we need to be researching and investigating to understand exactly what's going on. Because the simple narrative is it's all guided by the state, right? But once you start to dig in more detail, it might be a bit more complicated than that. What about using Tibetan populations to settle new lands in the form of settlement constructions at the border as efforts towards territorialization on the border too? Yeah, I mean, that's what Robbie wrote about a few years ago. And again, I think that would be in the TAR specifically. And I suspect it wouldn't change the county population per se, because there would be probably using people from the county working within the county and and so on. So you wouldn't necessarily see that in these data per se, but it's possible. But there's more questions here. There's a new message.
Yes, they were live, but while you were answering, Chu Tim Gung here already written it out. So please demystify the idea of 6 million Tibetan population and give the current global Tibetan population number.
Yeah, I'm amazed because I gave a presentation a couple of months ago to a bunch of exiled government people, and I was amazed by how sensitive this issue still is. Even just the suggestion that the Tibetan population is now 7 million seems to be very sensitive. But I mean, I think the best person to read on this is Jeff Child's book on Tibetan transitions. He gives an excellent sort of deconstruction of the numbers and based on sort of the historical evidence and so on. I think, Jeff, you might have written some articles about it too, or is it mostly in your book? I can't remember. But just to say that the idea of 6 million Tibetans in the 1950s wasn't really supported by evidence per se. I mean, in the TAR, the Tibetan government itself gave the Chinese their estimate of the population as 1 million, right? Not including Chamdo, and then maybe another 250,000 for Chamdo. So that was the Tibetan government, the Podrong, the Ganden Podrong that gave that estimate, and it was finger in the wind type of estimate, right? Because they didn't have any proper censuses or surveys. So if you consider that the other Tibetan areas were approximately double that, or maybe slightly more than double that, then, you know, we could have potentially been looking at a population in the range of, I don't know, 2.5 million or 3 million, perhaps, right? And then that would be consistent with the population reaching about 6 million by just before 2010, because at the rates of population growth that it was experiencing, we'd expect a doubling in about, you know, 30, 40 years, right? Or maybe even less. So there's nothing, if you understand demographics, there's nothing inconsistent with these points. But yeah, I think, and then so today, according to the 2020 census, the population is just over 7 million. And then if you add on the exiles, we don't even know how many people are in exile right now. But I know the exile government with I forget his name, was a PhD in geography who was doing a lot of the surveying for the exile government. The estimate back in the sort of mid-2000s was about 130,000 people. A lot of whom have now have immigrated out of India and Nepal. But you know, if you account for maybe 8% population growth a year from 2020 onwards, you'd probably be looking at a Tibetan population running around 2.3, 2.4 million right now. Sorry, 7.3, 7.4, possibly even 7.5 if you include the exiles, right? That would be my guess if I'd have to make a guess. But
thank you so much.
Sorry, Jeff, you wanted to say something, Jeff?
Yes, please.
Yeah, not about the total population. That's a different issue. But on your paper, well, thank you, Isabel, for organizing this, and Natalia, and also thank you, Andrew, for presenting all this data. You'll probably recognize these comments because, and if you've gotten your peer reviews back, I think when there's two demographers, you know, working in Europe and US, North America on Tibetan populations, it's obvious who's reviewing who.
Yeah.
But I want to probe further because, you know, the macro view is pretty interesting. It's fascinating, as a matter of fact. But so much of the detail needs to be explored at kind of the provincial or county level. And I'm just wondering, what does the census have now on, for example, you really need data on age-sex composition to make your supposition that the growth is being driven by births, because as you know, the natural increase is a factor of births and deaths. So you need information on the crude death rate as well as the crude birth rate. If the crude birth rate could stay the same, the death rate drops, and that could account for the population growth. You know, so I think you're probably correct, but I think you need more detail on that. And also, you know, a few illustrative examples from like Golok. Okay, we see, you know, pretty significant 1.6% annual growth, which is pretty robust growth in today's world, especially considering that China's population just fell for the first time since the Great Leap Forward in 2023. Do you have data? How detailed does the census get at those kind of smaller levels in terms of 5-year age cohorts? You've referenced you know, the youth ratio, which I assume you're using as 0 to 14, but that's only one part of it. Is it possible to break down the population by age and sex into 5-year or even 1-year cohorts? Because that's where you could account for a lot of this natural increase. If there's a big bulge in the childbearing years, you could have low fertility, but still population growth because a large percentage of the population is concentrated there. So that's really where I want to push you in terms of data. Can you get crude rates? Can you get fertility rates? Can you get detailed composition to really explore this further, you know, using at least a few small case studies?
Yeah. In terms of the crude birth rate, death rates, obviously I was simplifying it by saying it was births, but what I meant natural population increase rates in terms of birth minus deaths. But I think generally whatever data we have, I mean, we don't really see, like elsewhere in the world, we see the death rates falling down to quite a low level already now for decades, and you know, not really changing. We don't necessarily change around that. But the problem is that we don't get these data for I can't get the crude birth rates and death rates at so far I haven't found it at the county level, and certainly not broken down by the minzu categories. So when they provide the minzu data, they provide certain bits of information when they decompose it by the ethnicity or nationality. but a lot of the interesting data that you would want to know, they don't provide it. And so you have to go kind of work by inference, right? And triangulating and thinking. So that's why I show the youth ratio, because the youth ratio, a high youth ratio combined with a high population growth rate, I don't think would. Because the thing is, the youth ratio is also affected by outmigration. Because if you have net outmigration, they're going to be primarily adults outmigrating, which will basically inflate both the old age and youth ratio, right? So if you see a county like in Wenchuan or the eastern counties on the border with China, in Ngawa and in Gannan and Gardasey, for instance, there you would see very slow population growth and perhaps some higher youth ratios, or also you see quite high old age ratios, right, of 65 and plus. And they look like more classic cases where basically the working age population is just basically, like massively outmigrated, leaving young people and old people, right? And to the extent that some of these counties along the border almost look like retirement communities or something, right? Mm-hmm. But in that sense, but when you're looking at this thing like Golok, like Darlak and Golok, then if you're seeing a very high youth ratio with also quite of a robust high population growth rate of 2.5% a year, there will obviously be net outmigration inflating that. I know people from Darlak who have outmigrated, so it's happening. But it's what I would say it's primarily explained then by natural population increase rather than by migration dynamics, at least for the Tibetans. Because also I don't think there's many Tibetans who would be migrating to Darlak. There might be some competing for professional opportunities like teachers or government officials or whatever. It's the complaint that a lot of local people have, is that the people from the farming areas are coming to take our jobs. But that's mostly at the level of government employment, which is very scarce, right? Yeah. And demographically, it probably wouldn't be that significant. So yeah, it's a lot of guesswork because we simply don't have the data, and I would love to have more data. But on the cohorts, yeah, they provide 5-year cohorts, not 1-year cohorts. Again, a frustration. Same with education. I would love to see education attainment rates by age, because I discussed this with Mel Goldstein years ago.
Hang on 1 second. I've got a.
Oh,
I got somebody doing something in my house right now. He's calling me. But thanks. I agree with your inferences. I just think that to verify it, we really need more fine-grained data.
I agree. I agree completely with you. Yeah. No, of course. And one thing I was going to say, unfortunately, Jeff left this. As I said, I could find the population structure data by 5-year cohorts per nationality in Qinghai. That's what I mean by Qinghai is very generous with their data. I couldn't find that for, say, Sichuan or Gansu. And so there it's all Tibetans in Qinghai. It's not giving you the information per county or per prefecture. But because it's all Tibetans, then at least most of them are from Tibetan areas. And what's fascinating there is you see this population structure where the largest cohort is actually, as I was saying, the 5 to 9-year-olds. I would love to discuss this with Jeff, actually, because what Jeff was referring to would be like the baby boom echo effect, where you have a baby boom, say in the 60s, and then as those people who were born in the 60s start having kids, even though they have a lot less kids because of falling fertility, because there's a lot of them having kids, you have a sort of mini baby boom happening 20, 30 years later. But instead of what we see in the Tibetan Qinghai population is actually, you see that bulge in, for the Chinese, the peak, the largest cohort is basically the cohort that was born in the early 70s. And then you have the introduction of family planning, fertility drops to replacement levels, and then you have a slight, 20, 30 years later, a slight increase, but it's nothing compared to the largest cohort born in the early 70s, right? So it's more like a shape, like the population pyramid is like this, and then like that, and then down again, right? But that second bulge is smaller than the first bulge, the older bulge. And so the largest cohort of the Han in Qinghai currently is in the age of around 50 years old, right? The Tibetans experienced that first bulge in the 90s instead of the 70s because of delayed family planning and so on. And so what you see, that first bulge of Tibetans are the Tibetans who are approximately 30, 35 years old right now. But what's interesting is that then the cohort, that cohort, if it would just be the baby boom echo effect, then that cohort would have at lower fertility rates a lot of kids, but that second bulge would be smaller than the first bulge. But what happens is from 2005 to 2015, it explodes, and then it becomes larger than even that earlier cohort. And that I don't have an explanation for. Because the baby boom effect would explain part of that, but the fact that this cohort aged 5 to 9 is the largest cohort in all of Qinghai history, close to 150,000 people, 50,000 Tibetans. This is just Tibetans, right? You see the same thing happening with the Hui Muslim, for instance. So the Hui Muslim has that same thing going on, whereas you don't see it among the Chinese. So that's why I immediately wrote to, when I realized this, I immediately wrote to my Tibetan PhD student from Qinghai and said, "Did you know there was a baby boom?" And she was like, she didn't quite believe it, I don't think. But then, I talked to another one of my Tibetan PhD students who's like, yeah, well, because the point is that a lot of family planning was quite lax in Tibetan areas, especially remote Tibetan areas. So right up to the 90s, you would have had still fairly high fertility in the more remote areas like Golok and Yushu. But even then, we know even in those areas, the census shows that fertility has fallen to below replacement, even in Golok and Yushu. So we shouldn't be seeing that second bulge in 2005 to 2015, unless there was an increase in fertility. But I can't explain that, right? And Jeff, I hope you heard all that, but because I'd love to discuss it with you.
Sorry,
But
just about the end.
anyways.
I had to pay my
No. But did you hear
paramedic.
Did you hear that story? Did you hear that story about the echo effect and the? Or you just
No,
came back
I
into
just
it?
got back, but we can talk about it later.
Okay, so but very quickly, Qinghai Tibetans, the echo effect typically is you have, like, in the early 70s, you have the largest cohort of Chinese.
Yeah.
And then maybe 20, 30 years later, you have another little mini baby boom. That's the echo effect of that large cohort from the 70s as fertility fell, right? But in the Qinghai Tibetan population structure, that first bulge happens in the 90s instead of the 70s because of delayed family planning.
Mhm.
And delayed fertility fall. But then you suddenly have this huge bulge that's even larger than the initial bulge from around 2005 to 2015. And that I don't
That means
explain.
fertility would have to still be high.
Exactly. There must have been an increase in fertility during those years.
Yeah, because usually
the
the
only way I
echo
could
is going to
explain it.
result in a bulge, but a smaller cohort, because if it's below replacement fertility or low fertility, they're not going to be producing the number of kids that the previous
Yeah. No, but
so
the thing is that this second bulge is larger than the first bulge. It's not small. The echo effect is always smaller than the first bulge.
exactly.
This
So that
one's
means
like substantially larger.
So fertility still had to be high,
So
or at least
the population,
like 3.
yeah, no, exactly. So the population pyramid in the Chinese kind of looks like this, and then a bit like that, and then goes down. The Tibetans, it looks like later like this, but then like that.
Wow.
So something's going on. So I don't know what happened. Maybe in Golok they suddenly had a baby boom, or so everyone started having babies, or I don't know how to explain it, but it's fascinating if the data is correct.
Nice.
But the problem is that the fertility currently in 2020 census, the fertility rates are way below replacement everywhere across Tibet. I don't even show the data because it's so consistent. It's like whether it's Golok, Yushu, it's like 1.4, 1.5. So currently fertility is really low. Anyways, that's I'm still working on that, trying to understand but I don't think these can really be answered without field work. You know what I mean? That's the thing.
We have a question.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
John Levitt.
Yeah, I'm speaking from profound ignorance here, but is it possible that there's some kind of in this specifically Tibetan baby boom, is it possible there's some element of deliberate political resistance? I mean, here in Quebec, the famous all through the 50s and 60s, people talked about la revanche des berceaux, the revenge of cradles. We're going to outpopulate the English.
Yeah.
No, just a thought.
But in Quebec, even as they said that, fertility plummeted. and became like Southern Europe, basically, right? And so, I mean, but Jeff has written about this. He wrote this fantastic, the first time I met Jeff, actually, he gave this fantastic presentation at the EATS where he was like, looking at, talking to people saying the exile community is like, how many children should you have? Well, we should have lots of children to save the nation. How many children are you going to have? Are you going to have 4 children? No, absolutely not. I have to finish university first, and then, and so on. And it's simultaneously, he was showing also how fertility was following almost with the exact same pattern inside Tibet. So that's kind of the conventional wisdom that we've been working with since then. This is why this finding surprises me so much, because it could be an intentional effect to have lots of babies, but usually, despite the intention, we don't see that reversal happening, right? Yeah, and it would have happened, and then it would have disappeared, right? Because by 2020, fertility rates, if they're accurate, are well below replacement. So but Qinghai Amdo is a very special place. So there's the political mobilization in Amdo is, whether it's in language or whether it's in literature or whether it's in Tibetan medium education, they've been the leaders in all of these things, right? And it's quite possibly a unique situation in Qinghai, Tibet as well, right? But yeah, again, I don't have an answer for it.
Okay. We have one more question from Pema Dolman, and she says that if she remembers correctly from your research, you said that while Han migrants tend to stay in Tibet temporarily only and constitute an overwhelming minority, they are attracted to different economic incentives and tend to yield more economic power, salary, better employment, comparing to Tibetans. Is this still true? And if so, could you make some further comments on that?
Well, it'd be definitely true in TAR, because if you're seeing an accelerated increase of the Han population in TAR concentrated in the urban areas, as Tibetans are migrating from rural areas into those urban areas, even if I did that, I think I did an estimate of that in my 2014 book, and maybe in a few things after that, where basically if you look at, if you take, you can take the Han population, it might be, well, say based on the 2010 census, 8% of, or even the 2000 census, it was 6% of the population. But it was, I can't remember the exact number. I mean, maybe 20% of the urban population, and maybe like almost 50% of urban employment, if you assume that most of them are economically active, right? By 2010, I think that went down to 40%, but it went down to 40%, like where the Han migrants were roughly approximately, say, 40% of urban employment. But that was in a context where there's a huge migration from the rural areas. And also where there was a lot of my analysis was drawing from the 2000s, where there was the end of the FENPE, the employment guarantee in Tibetan areas, delayed. It was slower than what happened in other parts of China. But in Qinghai, TAR, and other places, it was gradually phased out around 2003, 2004, 2005. And it was that context where Tibetans who were going through, say, the university system, with the expectation to have a guaranteed job at the end, hence they could study Tibetan literature and still get a government job, suddenly found themselves coming into a competitive labor market that was prioritizing, Chinese language skills, and where their degrees weren't valued. And then I think that was one of my explanations for the buildup of tensions that led to the 2008 protests. But then what happened then is that they had this big hiring surge then after that, right? Where they were starting to hire a lot of Tibetans as well, which completely changed the situation. And then after that, that all dried up around 2016, just as, the more assimilationist policies were coming in around 2016, 17 under Xi Jinping. And then since then, I don't really have a good reading of what's been happening. But I think the key thing is that the urbanization is so fast that it puts a huge amount of pressure, regardless, on the limited number of good urban employment opportunities, right? I mean, so what we've seen in the urban areas is this huge expansion in urban employment, but the huge majority of it is, or a large part of it is more sort of informal and secure forms of employment, whereas the sort of coveted government jobs that have good salaries, social security, and so on are quite limited in a lot of these areas. Hence the reason why a lot of people who have education then migrate out, right? So a lot of migration itself could be driven, for instance, by education in that sense. So that would be what I'd say, but definitely in also in Lhasa, I'd have to update the numbers, look at some of the labor market data and so on. But I suspect you're seeing that this increase to 12% Han Chinese shares in something like Lhasa, downtown Lhasa, has an enormous impact on sort of on local employment in that sense, right? Yeah, but it would require more research in that sense. Dawa says, it's interesting that you were saying there's no increasing overall Han migration to Tibet, but you also said there's increasing Han migrants in the urban spaces of Tibet, such as Lhasa. So is it possible that there may not be increasing Han population overall, but there may be majority of yes, well, that's what I was trying to see, is that basically what I said is the two parts of Tibet, right? In the beginning, there's what's happening in the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is definitely increasing share of Han. There's definitely net immigration of Han Chinese, and increasing share of Han in the population across all the prefectures of Tibet, even the more remote ones. Although it's heavily concentrated in places like Lhasa. And so there, the classic argument remains, right? But the Tibetan areas outside Tibet Autonomous Region, you see the opposite happening. You see the outmigration of Han Chinese. That's what I was arguing, yeah. It feels strategic from the state's end. Well, the thing is that, I can go further into the data as well, because on this ethnic data or nationality, minzu data, also by urban, rural, and city, town, and rural areas. So I could go, for instance, I haven't had the time to do that yet, but I could go and say Golok or Tsoro, Chapcha. I could look at Chapcha, for instance, and say, where's the Han Chinese population located in Chapcha? Is it like Chapcha City, or in the towns, or in the rural areas? And I suspect you would see almost nothing in the rural areas and mostly in the cities. And so then you could recalculate it to say, has their share of the city population increased or decreased, right? But I suspect it's decreased as well, because you're seeing this huge depopulation of the rural areas, right? Going on across, well, at least across, eastern Tibet, you have rural depopulation, and all that's going into the urban areas and so on. So this is work I still need to do to be able to give you the evidence on the numbers on it and so on. But it's available. The data is available to measure those types of things. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Is
You're
there
welcome.
anything else? Or I also wanted to ask something. Is there data already available on how COVID affected Tibetan areas, and could it have affected also the outmigration, or I don't know, in-migration of Han Chinese, Hui, and so on? Muslim.
Sorry, what I didn't understand.
And
the first part of the question.
Yeah. Is there already data available on how COVID affected the demographic situation in Tibetan areas? Is it anyhow different from, I don't know?
Well, one of my first questions, looking at the census data, was to what degree what I was observing, say, with the collapsing numbers of Han Chinese due to COVID, for instance. But the only thing is that the census was conducted in November 2020, and by that time, if you remember, everyone was out on the streets having a good time. All the articles we were reading at the time was that China was back to normal. We were in chaos, right? And although China was hermetically sealed to the outside, it was only later, about I think, correct me if I'm wrong, 2022, when then COVID went wild in China in that sense. So it is possible that, you know, it is possible that that the initial lockdown in January, February 2020 would have caused a lot of Han out-migration from Tibetan areas. Although, on the other hand, people were just locked down where they were, right? So they didn't necessarily, you know, or they might have traveled back for the Spring Festival and then been locked down there. But generally speaking, people were locked down where they were resident. And if that, but then it all reopened up several months later, and then it was back to normal by November. And so the one thing I could see is that because of these underlying structural factors that tend to encourage out-migration from these peripheral, you know, areas that we typically see in development and so on, is that maybe COVID was a bit like, you know, in the, you know, the families or the individuals sort of livelihood strategy, so to speak. They're increasingly thinking, I just got to leave. I got to go find a job. I got to move to Beijing or whatever. But you don't yet, because it takes a lot of, you know, energy to do that. And then maybe COVID comes along and suddenly, like, that's the straw that breaks the camel's back type thing. And then you just pack up and leave. Maybe there was that thing, but it's still making the point that there's this underlying tendency that is driving these outflows. But the other thing too is we're talking about changes between 2010 and 2020. I don't think everyone left in 2020, right? I think this is probably a gradual process of out-migration happening. In Haishi, I've hypothesized, I don't have proof for it, but I mean, there was a lot of economic instability in the mining industry in Qinghai around 2013, when mining prices, if you remember, there was a commodity boom, and then mining prices just collapsed. And a lot of the companies in Qinghai were struggling right through from then. I think in 2019, a major state-owned mining company had been borrowing offshore dollars and then defaulted on its offshore dollar debt. And then again, it was all hushed up by the government. We didn't hear from it again, whatever. But it was just one of these it was the first offshore default in China, and it was in Qinghai, right? So it was probably a company that was involved in the Haishi Basin, you know, that's Taidam Basin. So it's just to say that there was a lot of economic instabilities that were happening in Shanghai at the time, where you can see it in the GDP data as well, is that the mining sector and the secondary sector was booming up to 2013, and then suddenly it collapsed in actual real value, not just as a share of GDP. And what the government then did is it's essentially financialized its way out of this collapse in the mining sector by this huge expansion in finance, insurance, and real estate, right? Similar to the way the US or Canada perhaps sort of tried to. So, but it's quite possible that those underlying economic dynamics would have undermined a lot of sort of the sort of long-term resident Han migrants, their willingness to stay in the region. But it also could just be a generational shift as well, where you might have had, you know, parents retiring who had moved there in the 60s and 70s, but their kids don't want to stay in, you know, you think of like, I don't know, kids who were born in the forestry industry in Abitibi or in Chicoutimi, and, you know, they all want to go to Montreal or Quebec City, right? They don't want to stay in Abitibi or Chicoutimi, right? So whereas the parents might have stayed there, once they retire, they move out, and the kids just say, well, I'm not staying here, right? All sorts of things like that could have been happening too. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions? No?
Well, Andy, if
Yeah.
you can still handle, you've been going for nearly 2 hours now,
Yes,
so I
I was also thinking that we are very, very much abusing Andrew's time. Dawa says, based on the fact that the US and Canada has historically skewed data on indigenous populations, don't you think China would do so, I guess?
Skewed data in what sense? You mean they're
Maybe
you mean manipulate? Yeah, I mean, there's always that possibility, right? But I mean, actually, I don't know if you're one of the reviewers, Jeff, but this article on AMDO, I've already been revising it while waiting for the reviewer comments because I haven't received them yet. But in revising it, I addressed these types of issues a bit more. in the one thing is that when we look at these data to a certain degree, I think they've been deep into the census data. I think it happens in the public presentations of data because it would require a huge amount of demographic skill to manipulate the data in a consistent way across a whole variety of different sort of data sets, right? Where they have to be consistent with each other. And so by triangulating a bunch of different data sets, but then also confirming them with field work, which I'm not able to do, but some of my Tibetan PhD students are. It's that whole process that brings us to a more inductive process of trying to validate what we're seeing. And I haven't yet come across anything that stands out like in any obvious way as data manipulation. Other issues that people have raised are intermarriages, and if somebody has intermarried with a Chinese person, do their children become Chinese or Tibetan? But one interesting thing is there was some research based on the 2010 census showing that Tibetans, together with Uyghurs and Kazakhs, have the lowest rates of intermarriage in China, actually. The slightly even fell between the vast majority of Tibetan marriages happen among Tibetans. And I don't have the data, but it would be interesting to update that, obviously. Another issue that people raise is about minzu identity switching, so nationality switching. So you take on an ethnic minority status to be able to get preferential policies and so on. The only thing there is I think that's really a story of the 80s and 90s. I think that type of switching of identity pretty much ended by the 2000s. And a really good case for looking at that is actually the Qiang, because the Qiang, when they were first, formally named by the People's Republic of China in the early 1950s. At the time, there was only about, I think, 35,000 of them, because a lot of the Qiang were being misclassified as Han Chinese because they were quite assimilated already and quite similar to the Han Chinese in demographically. And then in 1980, when they opened up the possibility to change your ethnic status, a lot of people switched to Qiang status. A lot of them legitimately because they were misclassified, and a lot of them, obviously, some people were taking advantage of this to get preferential policies. But so what you see is that a very rapid expansion of the Qiang population over the 80s and 90s, but that basically ends after 2000. You don't see any really significant increase in the Qiang population after 2000. Now, they were obviously heavily hit by the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008. I think 30,000 Qiang died during the earthquake. But nonetheless, we see, very slow growth in the Qiang, suggesting that basically that process ended. But again, we would more likely see this process of identity switching among ethnic groups that are more integrated, like versus the Tibetans who are less integrated and quite distinct and low rates of intermarriage and so on. And also, especially from 2010 to 2020, I think the incentive of switching to a minority status to take advantage of preferential policies had more or less was no longer really an issue anymore. I don't think. I don't think there was a strong, maybe in the 80s and 90s, which was like the golden years of preferential policies, that would have been a strong incentive. But I think by 2010, when it's already very clear there's a strong assimilationist sort of orientation of policy, I think that incentive to switch to minority status possibly works in the opposite direction, right? So it's hard to know in that sense. But those are the main arguments of either manipulation or distortion in the statistics that could be, but it's not clear again which direction they would be pushing things, and it's not clear that they would be having much influence by the 2010s. But I'm open to be contradicted if somebody can make a strong, case. I've exhausted you.
Thank you so much. We will not exhaust you anymore. Thank
No,
you.
no, no. It's a pleasure for us to share all this data because it's rare that we have an audience that's
Yes, and it's a pleasure to have
fascinated by
you.
this.
I'm extremely grateful to you. We actually met for the first time in 2011. You probably don't remember me because I was
Yeah.
just student assistant at the seminar it was a workshop in Copenhagen,
Yeah.
organized by
Copenhagen.
Trina and Ildiko.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
I remembered you from back then, and it was a great pleasure for you that you agreed to be part of this series and that you talked here for 2 hours. We're very, very grateful. Thank you. And
Yeah.
we're very happy that you shared with us what you have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all of you who've stayed on.